Welcome to Season 2 of the Banderpod, the illustrious and imaginative podcast of Bandersnatch Books. We're a small press publisher of treasures found off the beaten path for lovers of all that is good, true, and beautiful. I'm Rachel Donahue, and before we begin today, I just want to say thank you to all our readers and listeners for encouraging us in our work here at Bandersnatch Books. We love doing what we do, but when we see you cheering us on in our work, it's wind in our sails. We hope you're enjoying the work of our many authors and illustrators. We've got some really good conversations lined up this season, so you can get to know some of these delightful people even better. Today, I'm talking with Rebecca Gomez about her process, rejections, and storytelling in verse. Rebecca is the author of Mari and the Margins, a middle grade novel in verse recently published by Bandersnatch Books. Rebecca Gomez, welcome to the Banderpod.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm so glad we get to continue our conversation because we recently had a conversation on the Habit podcast with Jonathan Rogers. And if any of our listeners haven't heard that conversation, please go check it out. There's a lot of really fun information in that. But I wanted to kind of expand on our conversation a little bit and go a little bit deeper on a few things. But before we do that, why don't you give kind of the 30-second elevator pitch of Mari and the Margins for any of our listeners who may not be familiar with your book?
Mari and the Margins is about a girl named Maribel, and she is the middle of 9 children, and she feels overwhelmed and overlooked in her very large family. She's in the margins, or at least that's how she feels. So she longs to be noticed, but at the same time, she kind of doesn't see anything about herself that's especially worthy of notice. But she writes poetry and she doodles. And when she hears of a school poetry contest, she decides that she's going to enter in the hopes that this will be her chance to finally feel seen.
When you first brought your manuscript for Mari and the Margins to us, I just fell in love with Mari from the beginning. And I am so excited to see this book in the hands of people and to see people enjoying Mari the way we did and really connecting with her story and enjoying your writing. And it's just such a delightful book. So I remember one of the things we discussed, and I would really like to dive more into this, is the fact that Mari and the Margins started as a picture book idea.
Yes.
Well, before we do that, you have published picture books previously. And
Yes.
So it was a natural thing for Mari to kind of start as a picture book idea. Mention real quick the picture books that you've published so far.
Yeah, okay. So my first picture book is titled What About Moose? And I wrote that book and 3 subsequent books with my friend Corey Rosen Schwartz. So that's a rhyming picture book about a group of friends building something together, and one of the characters kind of gets carried away with wanting to run the show, and it's funny and it's kind of heartfelt. And then we have Hansel and Gretel Ninja Chicks, which is a retelling of Hansel and Gretel with the witch is a fox and the siblings are chickens and they're ninjas.
That's delightful.
Full of puns if you enjoy puns in your picture books.
Yes.
And then we have 2 stories about these 2 trucks named Mac and Rig. The first one is called 2 Tough Trucks, and it's about them meeting at their first day of truck school. And the second one is called 2 Tough Trucks Get Lost, and that's about them heading off into this big, truck park, and they get separated and it starts to get dark. So kind of a classic, I just got lost or separated from somebody.
Wonderful.
Which happened to me as a kindergartner. And then I have my own picture book called Federico and the Wolf, and that is a retelling of Little Red Riding Hood with a boy main character. He's on his way to visit his grandfather. And it's got some Mexican influence in that story.
I love it. So. These all sound delightful.
They are.
It sounds like you really have a knack for putting your finger on the things that I would enjoy in a picture book. And one of the things we've talked about within Bandersnatch is the similarities between the way a picture book is structured in poetry, because you're limited to very few words and everything has to be concise and to the point. So talk about how her story started. Like, what was your idea that it would be with a picture book? And then how did it change the writing of her story to shift to a novel in verse?
Okay, so yeah, Mari and the Margins did start out as a picture book idea, and it was actually originally called Little Belle Lost or something like that. I don't know. That was my working title. I pictured a little girl named Belle who was the middle child in a large family who felt kind of lost. And I imagined it being kind of centered in like a big family party where everything was just kind of crazy and busy. And the story's resolution was pretty much the same as the resolution in the novel. And I even recently, as I was just looking through some of my old notebooks and stuff, I actually realized that I had written some little rhyming passages for this
Oh,
book.
fun.
So I never wrote an entire draft as a picture book. I just kept experimenting with this one little rhyming thing, and I never got beyond it. So I started brainstorming a little bit more about the main character, and I realized that there was a lot more of her story to tell. And so I decided to write it as a middle grade book with an older, instead of like a, elementary school age kid,
Right.
middle school aged
Yeah.
kid.
So once you made that decision to pivot, how do you go about writing a novel in verse? What is that process like? Because being a poet, I get crafting one poem or even a picture book if you've got like a story that you're telling in the arc and the rhymes. But a novel in verse, you're almost creating scenes in each poem, and you're tying together themes across the arc of the story, and you do it. And so, like, how do you go about even beginning a project like that?
Right. It does seem kind of daunting because yes, each poem kind of has to work by itself, but they all have to work together to form an overall narrative. So yeah, it is challenging. And the way I go about it is kind of different for every story. For example, I have one of my novel in verse manuscript that came to me just as this image of these two characters on this journey, and I was like, who are these guys? It had a poetic feel, and so I wrote this scene. And anyways, but in the margins, since I had the whole picture basically, because I had thought of it as a picture book. Picture books usually come to me either as some kind of quirky title or like this whole like beginning, middle, and end just kind of condensed into this little nugget. So I had the whole thing basically mapped out in my brain, just at least those three main points. And so really I just started writing. I think the first poem that I wrote was actually the haiku. That's the first poem in the book.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
And that just really kind of got the ball rolling. I was like, okay, this is who Maribel is.
Yeah.
And so from there, I don't really write necessarily in a linear way. I just kind of you might have a scene that wants to happen later in the story, and so I will write that poem. But so it kind of ends up a little bit like this little patchwork quilt where you have all the pieces scattered around, and you have to put them together in a way that's pleasing and makes sense.
Yeah.
So a lot of times that's what I do when I'm writing.
Yeah.
And then you have to, once you have it all put together as a draft, and it's usually kind of a mess.
Right. And that's where the editing fun begins.
Yes. Which is where I really thrive. I love revising. So
I do too. I wonder if that's a poet thing or if it's just a personality thing. So
I don't know.
If you're a poet and you're listening, feel free to drop in the comments. We really want to know, do you love the revision process, or is that just a quirk of me and Becky?
Right.
All right. So you've said you've written like 4 or 5 novels in verse. I want to hear about all of them. So can you even if it's just like a theme or a title or something, I'm just curious, what other novels in verse does Rebecca Gomez have simmering in her brain?
Yeah. Yes. So my first novel in verse manuscript that I wrote is actually a fantasy story. And it was originally middle grade, and then I kind of changed it to be young adult, and now it's kind of, I guess, upper middle grade. I don't know. I probably have to revise it again. But it's a fantasy story, and it's kind of that classic, the main character realizes she has this power that's undeveloped, and she has to use that magic that she has to save her family and her country from these evil invaders.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then I have a young adult novel in verse, and I title it House of Bones, and it's about the main character has an interest in photography and abandoned houses, and it leads her to meet this young man, and they kind of it's a forbidden romance story. But
Interesting.
it's a very, very clean forbidden romance story.
Yes, we're champions of that.
I have a thing for fairy tale retellings, and so I have another one
Uh-huh.
that's another young adult story that's got elements of Hansel and Gretel and Little Red Riding Hood. So it's all about that you're trying to break a curse.
Interesting.
Of course, Mari and the Margins, that's the fourth one that I wrote. And I have a current one
Mm-hmm.
that's a work in progress that is set during the school children's blizzard of 1888. So it's a really high stakes survival
Wow.
story, and it's told in alternating perspectives. So
Interesting.
the main character, she gets caught in the storm, and then there's the people that are in
Mm-hmm.
the schoolhouse that are like, "What do we do?" Because we know she's out there. So the perspective shift. It's been really fun to write.
That's really interesting. That was actually going to be my next question. Does each of your novels and verse have one single voice that holds it together, or do you have multiple voices
Right. So it's
in the same collection?
and it's a big challenge. The fairy tale one is also two voices. It's
Hmm.
the main character and then her love interest who is cursed to live as a wolf.
Wow.
Anyway, so yeah, so this one actually has three voices, the Blizzard one. And it's been really, really kind of fun to work on it. I had to read a lot of like first person letters written by a teenage boy
Mm-hmm.
who actually lived in Nebraska, and in order to kind of figure out the voice of one of the characters.
Wow. That's
So I did a
fascinating.
lot of research on that. But
That's very cool.
it's frustrating to read stories that are written in multiple perspectives that don't really sound different. And so
Yes.
I've been really intentional to make sure that each character has their own voice.
I'm excited to see what that looks like. I know you've done a really good job with Mari in the margins and capturing her voice, and it's very distinct. And it feels like this is uniquely Mari's
Mhm.
voice. And I could absolutely see that you would be capable of pulling that off with multiple voices in one manuscript. So I'm fascinated to see more from you.
Thanks.
Yeah. So Mari is a 12-year-old, and you've done such a good job capturing her voice. How is
Mhm.
it that you are able to tap into your younger self? I was just thinking about, like, there's a quote by Madeline L'Engle that says that if you're 61 years old, you are also 13 and 16 and 28 and 42, and you're all of these ages and you have all of the experience. And so what was that process like for you, writing Mari's voice, kind of tapping into that 12-year-old?
I love that quote. Like Madeline talked about, I can put myself into my 12-year-old self and remember kinds of struggles that I had and what it was like to deal with friendship issues and all of those things and all of the just the weird awkwardness that we go through in middle school. I used to tell my kids that middle school is where you go to kind of figure out what kind of person you're going to
Mm.
be. My daughter, she says that she doesn't like the person she was in middle school.
Hmm.
And I just think that that was just part of her journey. And she's like even if she wasn't my daughter, she'd be one of my favorite people.
Hmm.
So, but yeah, if you can remember and you can feel that rawness of what it's like to be 12 and awkward,
Hmm.
then you can do it. And I think the reason we lose it is we start to notice what other people think about us more and we start to care
Yeah.
a little bit too much. And if we're not careful about that, then we just kind of get caught up in what it means to be growing up and become an adult. And
Yeah.
we forget
Yeah.
what it is like to be a kid and
Yeah.
have all that creativity. Because, all children, they will draw you a picture and they will happily show it to
Yeah.
and but a lot of adults they'll draw a picture and they'll be like, okay, I'm going to throw this
Right.
away or I'm going to shove it into my sketchbook and never show anyone.
Yeah. That you just kind of close yourself off to those possibilities. I think there are people who probably don't like who they were in middle school and kind of try to forget who they were. They forget the awkwardness and the rawness, like you said, of what it feels like to be that age. They kind of shut themselves off to that, like that they're beyond that.
I think also there's a lot of good things to remember about childhood and to hold on to,
Yeah. And I
just the
think
awkward.
being open to those good things may require that we have to be open to the parts of us that are more tender as well. Like there are probably hurts
Mhm.
from middle school or from those awkward years growing up if we didn't like who we were or we made mistakes or something like that. Like in order to be open to the wonder of childhood, you do have to be open to some of those tender parts of yourself too, and be willing to embrace them and love them
Indeed.
for the part of your journey that they are. And I didn't expect this to take kind of a therapeutic turn, but
yeah. But here we are.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. I mean, a lot of artists are sensitive people anyway, and are open to those emotional states, I think.
Yes.
But I think maybe that's one of the reasons, is that they're open to that childlikeness, and there are a lot of parallels with faith there as well, of that childlike. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
That reminds me of another quote from Madeleine L'Engle that says, "As we grow up and we are hurt, we learn not to trust. And that lack of trust is a wound as grievous as whatever caused it." And that, I think there is a loss of wonder when we close ourselves off, when we're not trusting, when we're kind of hardened to those things. We do protect ourselves from a certain level of pain, but we lose the playfulness of childhood. And so I'm really glad, Becky, that even as a grandmother, that you are able to tap into that creativity and playfulness and childlikeness to give us a story as good as Mari.
Well, thank you. I think the grandmother part actually helps a lot.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. All right, so shifting gears a little bit, one of the things we talked about was that you had 31 rejections from Mari before Bandersnatch said yes.
Yes.
So how did you navigate that? Like, I know we have a lot of listeners who are probably facing the same thing, listeners who maybe are just getting ready to submit manuscripts for the first time and who don't really know how to navigate these waters. But this is not uncommon. I mean, some of the most well-known published authors have many rejections. So talk about that a little bit, like how that felt. How did you overcome? How did you persevere in believing in the story, shaping it? Just talk about the whole process.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a long, arduous uphill climb, it kind of seemed. But, and that's the 31 rejections, that's only counting editors. So there was also, trying to find an agent before that.
Wow.
So that adds to the little pile, the kind of stinky pile of rejection. But honestly, with this story more than others, I felt like every time I got a rejection, it was like God was telling me to just trust in his timing. So I had a feeling about this book, I guess. Like, maybe it's just because I poured so much of myself into this story. It's not autobiographical, but there's a lot of me in Mari, coming from a large family and being kind of in the middle and everything.
Yeah.
So that really just kept me going. I just kept believing in the story and trusting that it was going to work out eventually. And the way I found you is actually my agent, who really, really loved Mari in the Margins, and she worked really hard to find it a home. And eventually we parted ways, and that's fine. So when that happened, it was very discouraging. But then I was like, you know what? I had heard about Bandersnatch books before, actually from the Habit podcast. And so I was like, well, what if I try one of these small presses that I'd heard about that seemed really promising? And so I did.
That's so cool. I love just the timing of all of that it did have a place in the world. It just wasn't the right time or the right place, the right people. And then when it came together, it just, for all of us, felt like, oh yeah, this is the right thing. This is a good fit. We can all have a big vision for this book.
Right.
So fun.
Yeah. And it was about 10 years. I had the idea for the story in 2010, but I didn't really start working on it as a novel in verse until around 2014. Wow. And so it was long, and, it could be disappointing at times. And I think, though, one thing you have to do is you have to keep working on other things. So, you can't just harp on one story. You have to keep working. And I think shifting gears and working on other projects and then coming back to Mari in the Margins probably helped the story be better, helped me grow as a writer. Yeah. And so if you believe in a story enough, you just got to keep at it. But, also let yourself be open to other possibilities.
Yeah, I love that. So you hear that, listeners? Persevere, push on, and don't stop writing. Keep going. Right. Believe in your work. Keep pushing, keep trying. I love that. That's really encouraging. I knew this conversation with you would be encouraging today.
I'm
Well,
glad.
before we wind down, I have some popcorn questions for you.
Okay.
All right. What are your favorite writing tools?
I usually use a composition notebook, unlike Mari in the margins. She uses a spiral notebook because they're cheap, you know. I
Right.
like composition notebooks. I do a lot of drafting by hand, and so I love a good
Mm-hmm.
mechanical pencil. And I like where is my pen? Anyway, I have this here's one. I forget. Energel. This Pentel Energel pen. It's very smooth,
Oh,
glide.
cool.
It's my
Yeah.
favorite pen. So those are my favorite writing tools.
Neat. So you do a lot of writing by hand. At what point does it move from handwritten to a screen?
Usually when I have a whole draft and I'm gonna edit.
So you get way through the writing process before you ever move it into a digital format.
Yeah, especially when I'm writing a novel in verse. For some reason, when I'm drafting a poem, it just feels right to write it by hand.
All right. So what is your usual writing spot?
It depends on if I'm drafting or if I'm editing. So if I'm drafting, I will just sit wherever I'm comfortable. So a lot of times, if the weather's nice, I like to be outside in my egg chair. It's like a tiny little mini vacation spot in my backyard.
Oh, I love that.
So, but maybe on the couch or sometimes in the car if I'm really working on something and we're busy.
Mm-hmm.
So really anywhere.
Very portable.
But I do have a little office in the upstairs of my house. It used to be my daughter's bedroom. So that's where I do most of my editing is in my office
Yeah.
on my computer.
All right. And one last question. Do you have a favorite word?
Yes, I do. My favorite word is serendipity.
Serendipity.
Yes.
That's a fun one to say.
Serendipity. Plus the meaning is really cool too. I love those moments when you discover something that you weren't looking for at the moment, but you knew you wanted.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Becky, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a lot of fun.
It's been a lot of fun for me too. Thank you.
Absolutely. So fun. And listeners, may you find bookish treasures in your wanderings off the beaten path. Thanks for listening in to our conversation today on the Banderpod. We hope you'll check out our full catalog at bandersnatchbooks.com. The Banderpod is produced by Rachel S. Donahue, A.B. Donahue, and Carolyn Claire Givens. Audio engineering by S.D.G. Morgan. Artwork by Evelyn Warnamundi. Many thanks to our friend Chris Slayton of Son of Laughter for our theme song, Cricket in a Jar. Find links and more in the show notes.